Right, hello. This is our second podcast.
Welcome back.
And what's the topic that we're going to do today?
So we decided to kind of shake it up a little bit and do a bit of Tudors this time. So we did Eisenhower foreign policy last time. So we thought carry on with the fun and do a bit of the Tudors. So we're going to do Henry VIII and royal supremacy.
Yay!
Yeah, I know. I can
Year
hear
one.
the screams of joy from
Yay!
people. So as kind of with the last podcast, what we're going to do is a little bit of content, and then we're going to go through a question together, kind of the argument that you would take and those kind of things as well. As always, you've probably got your booklets. Hopefully you've got a textbook that you can use to supplement some of the information we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, so what would you say is particularly important about this topic that we're looking at?
I suppose the significance of royal supremacy under Henry VIII is, well, it impacts on the second year as well. And your understanding of it in the first year really helps you out when it comes to the second year as well. The impact that it has, the effect that it has, changes Britain forever. So I suppose you could call it a minor significance.
But you're joking. You're being sarcastic. It's very, very significant. Like you're saying, it changes England forever, and also it's important that you really understand the break with Rome at this stage, so that when you get to look at Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, that you can see what changes happen there, the change, the continuity, because there's obviously a lot of backwards and forwards. So if you can understand what Henry VIII does, what it's like by the time he's dead, then you can see the change and continuity as well.
Yeah, and you've also got this idea of the royal supremacy doesn't just happen overnight. If it's a long drive forward for it, the Great Matter is obviously something that you have hopefully studied, and you've got booklets on that as well, but we're not going to cover that this time. The causes of royal supremacy aren't really what we're after today. It's all about the impact and how he's able to go about that as well.
The consequences of it.
It is. So, do you want to tell us of how is he able to establish get rid of Catholicism in England and establish himself as the supreme leader of the church?
Well, normally what we would do as a bit of a reminder, a bit of revision, is we encourage you to think about it in three ways. So think about, well, how powerful is the church? Where does their power derive from? And you would say that it's down to their reputation. They're seen as incredibly important, incredibly spiritual, the connection to God, as it were. And then they've also got power in terms of the amount of money that the church has.
They also hold a huge amount of power, whether that in the legal system or just in terms of authority as well. So it's quite a challenge to be able to just get rid of them overnight. And where you've got a country where pretty much everyone is Catholic, everyone follows the rules, to suddenly come along and say those rules are different is quite a difficult thing. So you've got to undermine as much as you can everything to do with the Catholic Church. So by going for reputation and their money and their power, you should be able to break that down and really establish a brand new regime, which is what Henry does.
To make it appealing, to make it make sense, because he couldn't just come along and be like, right, everyone, I'm head of the church and this is what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
It has to be more formulate than that, and a slow, gradual change as people get more and more used to the idea. Not to say that people are suddenly accepting of it completely, but it's the only way it's able to happen, is that it's slow and it's this constant grinding down, I guess, of the church's power in those three ways.
Yeah, and he's also got to be really careful in terms of rebellion. He has to justify all the changes that he's made, otherwise he could face, well, major scale rebellion. So it's quite difficult, really. So if we go with reputation first.
Yeah, so reputation is probably the easiest thing to start with, because it's not going to need acts, it's not going to need too much intervention. It's more subtle. It's just going to be encouraging people to remember that anti-clerical feeling that was going on under Wolsey, that the encouragement of perhaps declaring prima neri, that they are working in favour of the Pope rather than the King.
Yeah, the benefit you've got with going after the reputation of the Catholic Church is it's already damaged by the time of the royal supremacy. So kind of Wolsey's done a really good job at making the Catholic Church look bad. So it's just building on that, really. And he's able to do that with the use of scholars, kind of going around universities, finding academics, getting them to criticise the church, really developing ideas of like humanism,
The idea of royal supremacy not being a new thing, the fact that emperors in Rome were already like that in ancient Greece.
Yeah, and playing on the abuses, the idea of, you know, the corruption within the church and the corruption of the Pope in particular, I think really ties into that. And the idea that he gets preachers, you know, really prominent ones like Thomas Cranmer, to come along and kind of, you know, call out the church and talk about how corrupt everything is, really helps to undermine the authority and the reputation of the church as well.
Yeah, and get that message out there to really diminish their reputation as much as possible. And then he's able to follow it on with acts a few years later. From 1529, you've got in 1532 the supplication of the ordinaries, which leads on to the submission of the clergy, where they've got to actually declare an oath accepting Henry being the head of the church.
Yeah, and with the supplication of the ordinaries and then the submission, that's just the sign of weakness, really, from all the clergy, whereby they have to apologise for, well, I say it wrong, of praemunire.
Or praemunire.
Praemunire, of the idea of putting the Pope ahead of the king, which is a bit unnatural at this time. To charge everyone with that makes a really large statement. And the fact that they have a submission suggests an element of guilt to it as well. So it's, again, undermining the authority and playing on that corruption of the church.
Even though really it's almost like a bribe, isn't it? That if they don't do it, they're going to lose their jobs or worse, be executed.
Yeah.
And then you've also got the De Vera Obedentia by Stephen Gardiner, that is more academics reasserting the idea that Henry being head of the church is fine and totally acceptable. Yeah,
and you've also got people like William Tyndale, who had been criticising the church for a significant period of time. Tyndale was almost killed by Henry for criticising the Catholic Church when he was Catholic, of the idea being of, you know, developing books like The Obedience of a Christian Man, saying that you are a good Christian to listen to the king, because he's been picked by God. So really playing on that kind of authority, the hierarchy that is in Tudor society, to enforce the propaganda.
Yeah. And then you've got the second one, which is the one that I think is probably the easiest one to remember, and it's the financial attack on the church. What kind of things would you use to...
Well, basically, the finance is where they've got their power. Yeah. Again, it kind of ties into power, which is a little bit confusing, but it's more about the financial side to it. They can't fight a corner if they haven't got any money. So it goes after them quite heavy-handed in the idea of the annates, those taxes that are paid into the church.
Yeah.
So he gets to take them away. All that Peter's pence, you know, any money given to the Catholic Church, now instead of going to Rome, goes straight into his pocket, as well as the first fruits and tenths. We've got another focus on finance with the Valor Ecclesiasticus, with the dissolution of the monasteries. And you kind of see that financial motivation with things like the dissolution of the smaller monasteries, of going after them if they're earning less than £200. You know, and you know, when the dissolution of the monasteries happens, it's 10% of his whole income. So it shows that finances are a major motive for him.
And a good way of diminishing their power, because they have so much money. You attack it and you refunnel it back into the crown's coffers. You are really, really limiting any power they actually have in England.
Yeah, and it gives you more money to go around and spread propaganda as well. So it's, you know, two birds, one stone type thing.
And win people over, perhaps with a nice country pile that used to be a monastery. For those gentry that are looking to elevate their status in some way.
Yeah. And then we've got the power side to it. So the third strand of this argument, we've talked about reputation, we've talked about finance. Now it's the actual power and authority of the church, I think, is probably the better way of phrasing it. And, well, go ahead.
So you've got the restraint of appeals, so stopping anyone appealing to Rome over any decisions that have been made by the state courts, as it were. The courts that were used by the church are now all under the authority of the king. So if they don't like a result that comes out of their of the court, they could before go to the Pope and ask, I want you to look at it and I want you to tell me what I want.
Yeah.
They can't do that anymore. So that's what the restraint of appeals is.
Yeah, and you've also got, again, the idea of submission of clergy when they have to declare an oath to Henry, which again gets rid of their authority, that if they break that oath, they can be executed for it. That also ties into the act of supremacy. They've got to acknowledge that he is the head of the church, and any repercussions from that, if they go against it, they know they'll be executed for it. You know, the act of supremacy is passed in November 1534. The Treason Act is passed in the same month, and it's a really good argument that suggests that he's backing himself up to make sure that no one can speak out against him. and really get rid of that authority that they can't declare anything towards Rome anymore. It's all about being in England.
It's the final act needed to put him at the head of the church. That is the act of supremacy. And the Treason Act, just reinforces it. And if you don't like it, well, you're going to be executed. Even if you mention it, it's not just actions, it's words as well.
Yeah, and all of these acts, he's got the justification through propaganda, whereby it's imperial jurisdiction, that he's not found new powers. These are all medieval powers that he should have had. So actually declaring clergy to swear an oath wouldn't be too unusual, because he's got the propaganda to back it up at that time.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was a good way of just running down the three ways in which the act of supremacy or the royal supremacy is created. It's, again, reputation, finance, authority. So do we want to go on to a question?
Yeah, so we're kind of struggling with questions for this one, just because we haven't really got that many. So having gone through the archive, what we found was in 2016, in the old, what would be the AS level, which not many people do anymore, we found this question, which is just a joy. Again.
Yeah, there hasn't been any in the A level, so that would suggest that perhaps soon there will be one in the actual A level.
And it's such an important topic that it would be an all right question depending on the question that they ask you.
Yeah.
So the question that we found on 2016 was, despite the break with Rome, Henry never really abandoned his Catholic faith from 1529 to 1547. Now, it's not a bad question, but it would certainly take a little bit of time to think about it, to kind of look at it, to really pull it apart and think, well, what are the key parts of this question?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, the easiest bit to acknowledge is 29 to 47, so that's the start of the Great Matter and eventually the creation of him being the supreme head of the church.
Yeah, and again, I think we spoke about this in the last podcast, the importance of tearing apart the question and getting a good introduction to set the scene of your argument. And for this one, it would be really thinking about of abandoning his Catholic faith. So you've really got to kind of talk about, well, what is the Catholic faith? What are the major centre points for it? And you might talk about the sacraments, you might talk about transubstantiation, you might even talk about the authority of the Pope himself. So, it's all about defining that question and really thinking about, okay, if he's abandoned his Catholic faith, well, what would that look like? What does that mean? And how would it kind of present itself?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we thought we would break it down into three themes, because we like a thematic approach, and also where possible to counter each point, but make sure you're landing where you think overall. Like, so you've got really good judgments after you've looked at both sides of the argument for that theme. Yeah,
so the three kind of strands that we've gone for, and obviously it's open to interpretation, but the first one we looked at was the idea of the doctrine, the actual kind of documents of the church and how that works.
The theology.
The theology side to it. And kind of the acts that change the theology of the church and the ideas behind the Catholic Church as well. So,
but then the other two, should just say what those are as well. So the other, where we're going with the rest of this argument. So once we start off with the doctrine, we'll also then go on to talk about the experience and essentially the mass, how that changes, because that is very, very essential and fundamental to the Catholic faith. And then the third one
is the authority as well of that Catholic Church, of who has the authority, where and when. Are there any examples of that Catholic faith authority being challenged?
Yeah, okay. So do you want to start with the first point for doctrine then?
Yeah, so I suppose with the doctrine, you've kind of got this argument of the doctrine itself doesn't really change massively over the time of royal supremacy.
Especially by 47.
Exactly. So you've got some key kind of articles that you've got there as well. So one example would be the kind of 10 articles of the idea. These were brought in by Cromwell to re-establish and to develop a Protestant church. So this was challenging the authority of the sacraments, taking the sacraments down to 3, which annoyed a lot of Catholics, considering they like the sacraments. And that kind of really developed into it.
Yeah, and so with the 10 articles, with Cromwell managing these and creating these 10 articles that are very much in the line of Protestant faith, you have the ability then to sanction with the Treason Act those people that are seen as heretics, and that becomes Catholics and at times also Protestants. So you can use that as a bit of a counter as well. But he is burning and executing, hang, drawing and quartering Catholics, so that would certainly suggest he's got an issue there with
Yeah, and it questions this idea of faith as well. If he's so going to change the church, and we could credit Cromwell with those changes, but actually you've got to think of who's running the show here, and you've got to think about the idea of the motives of allowing those 10 articles to be passed. What does that tell us about his actual faith? And that's where you could really get into some really good evaluation for it. On the opposite side, you could argue that actually, well, the 10 articles are quite Protestant, but he counteracts them with the 6 articles.
Yeah, so with the 6 articles, he pretty much undoes a lot of what happens in the 10 articles, and it is very much orchestrated by Henry. He has the final say on these, more so than with the 10 articles. Obviously, it's like Cromwell's baby, the 10 articles. And he undoes the idea of transubstantiation not being as important. He reasserts the importance of that and the 7 sacraments. Yeah. And that's later on. So the idea of it, in that period, by 47... by 40 and 47 onwards, the last part of his reign, he is very much going down this middle way that is very much a Catholic belief rather than a Protestant belief.
Yeah, and you've got other examples as well of, John Lambert being executed. If there's real questions raised there regarding the faith that Henry has at that time. Yeah. And I think during the trial, isn't it, that he raises this idea of kind of the criticisms of the church and things like this as well.
Yeah, it's the fact that he had denied the importance of transubstantiation. He's executed on that behalf. If he's prepared to do that and make a very significant issue about that, transubstantiation, well, that would suggest that it's a faith that he upholds and believes in.
And that also ties into Cromwell's execution. Yeah. He is charged with going against the 6 articles, and as someone who was leading that Protestant change, for him to be executed for denying these 6 articles suggests that there's still an element of Catholic faith there.
He's going back on the decisions that he originally made, that perhaps at heart he was always a Catholic.
And again, an opportunity for evaluation of the motives behind that, because you could argue, well, is it his faith or is it the threat of invasion at that time as well? So again, an opportunity to develop it a little bit further. Yeah. If we move on to the next one, of the idea of the experience, the mass service itself, we could argue of, well, actually, the mass itself still stays relatively the same. Nothing radically changes at that time. We spoke about the 6 articles, not bringing back, but reinforcing transubstantiation. The mass is still in Latin. Pretty much the service is still the same for a lot of people. If they're attending a mass service, it's still the same as what it was 20 years before and things like this as well. It's not radically changed, that service itself, the experience that religious people would have at that time.
Yeah. And then the counter is, well, if you're a serious Catholic, as Henry is saying that he is, the Bible is considered to be an incredibly important document that should be lauded above all else and treated as such, and shouldn't be something that anyone can access and read and listen to. Yeah. And that obviously has changed, because all churches are meant to have one, or parishes are meant to have one. So if it's much more common and much more available, does that still suggest that the Bible has such an incredible importance? I mean, you could argue either way, but it goes against that fundamental belief that not everyone should be looking at it, should have the honour of that.
Yeah, and quite an important part of the Catholic faith is the hierarchy. So you get that with the Bible, the idea that you're starting to challenge the Pope's authority. And if you remember, he also does that with the Bishop's Book, of the idea of giving them a set rule of these are the behaviours that I expect from my bishops, which suggests that, he's the one in control. If he's challenging that Catholic hierarchy, which, as we said, as a good Catholic, does he have the right to do that? And it makes you think, well, is he actually Catholic then?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why I always spit that bit.
No, is he actually? Yeah. So then we've got the third theme. So what would your point be for authority? What would you open with?
Well, the authority one's quite an interesting one, because obviously this is the most important thing. The break with Rome, the royal supremacy, is all about his power. Now, we get loads of examples of where he breaks away from his Catholic faith, and whether that's things like the injunctions, whereby he breaks up Catholic faith and doesn't allow pilgrimages. Remember, pilgrimages allow Catholics to get out of purgatory. It's a tie to the sacraments, so he's challenging that authority a little bit. Towards the end of his reign, we see a little bit of iconoclasm, not as much as under Edward, but certainly a kind of threat of iconoclasm taking place. And also we've got the dissolution of the monasteries. A good Catholic shouldn't really be closing down the monasteries, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and I think really you're going to end up landing in your essay that ultimately, in terms of authority, he has abandoned his Catholic faith. But before you land there, you need to also acknowledge the counter-argument. So whilst you're introducing the things like the injunctions and the iconoclasm and dissolution of the monasteries, there is an argument there to say, well, that's mainly financially motivated. But and also the fact that he executes Cromwell and he's seen as the person who's orchestrated him, putting him as the head of the church. So he must have a problem with the actions that he's made there.
And again, it's motives of things like the dissolution of the monasteries. You could argue his justification for closing those monasteries is for the good of the Catholic faith itself. That
it's reforming it.
Exactly, that things had gone wrong and he was the guy to come in and save the day, and it's all about this justification for the good of the church. And that kind of ties into the bits that I can't pronounce.
Yeah, so the idea, the propaganda that he has of, well, the priests still have De Vera, Potestas.
Oh, challenge.
No, not De Vera.
No, it's Potestas.
Yeah,
Potatoes.
I'm talking
potatoes.
About... Yeah, but don't
I can't say.
The Potestas jurisdictionis is what Henry has. So he has like the legal authority over the church. And they have the Potestas ordinis, which is the spiritual power. Yeah. So he's not denying that they have the spiritual power. He just has the legal authority just to make sure that they're not up to anything bad.
And again, with the authority of, as we said before, you're probably going to land that his authority breaks away from his Catholic faith. And you could use that with things like Thomas More is a really good example of that. The burning, the executions of a number of individuals during his reign.
Can you really argue that a good Catholic would allow that to happen? If someone's still committed to their Catholic faith, are they really going to do that?
Yeah, and you've also got the act of supremacy itself. If a good Catholic is someone who believes that the Pope is supreme power and has been divinely picked by God, then the idea of the act of supremacy itself suggests that he's broken away from the authority of his own faith to be able to challenge that authority in the first place as well.
Yeah, so looking at those three themes then, so the doctrine, the experience, and then the authority, what overall judgment do you think you would come up with? What do you think you would argue is the weaker argument? So what's the whilst, as you start off with your conclusion, whilst there are...
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to this question of the idea of really getting a grip of what the Catholic faith means and tying that back to it. So for this one, it's the idea of the importance of the Catholic faith is the idea of sacraments and particularly transubstantiation. And if we looked at it, actually, that remains the whole way through his time period. And even though there are, I wouldn't say minor changes, there are changes to the authority.
And challenges.
Ultimately, things stay the same. Yeah. And the changes that are made are for the authority, not for the actual spiritual side to it.
Yeah. So you would probably start off with, say, there's been serious challenges to the church in terms of their authority, like the Supremacy Act, like the Bishop's Book, and the 10 Articles. But by the time he's dead in 1547, he has re-established the idea of Henry's middle way, so making sure people are fully aware that he's very much still in favour of the 7 sacraments and transubstantiation. But there is an argument that, well, is he just protecting his soul? Is it a Catholic faith, or is it partly a selfish agenda behind it as well, that he doesn't really want to not do that because he's worried about where he's going to end up in the end, considering all those bad things that he did.
Exactly. Pretty bad things, I'm not going to lie.
But yeah, I think we would ultimately say that he never really abandons it, because if you would argue that transubstantiation and the 7 sacraments are so fundamental to the Catholic faith.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's it. I think we've gone back and forth on that argument quite a bit. We've given you a bit of content. Yeah. We've gone through a question. We've given you a conclusion.
I've got a question for you.
Oh, here we go.
So, if you were to call the break with Rome, if you were to say it was a biscuit,
okay,
what kind of biscuit would the break with Rome be?
Oh, okay.
Or would it be easier to start with, well, first of all, what kind of biscuit is Henry VIII?
Oh, good one. It's got to be really kind of bitter, like and a ginger nut. Ginger nut.
And fat.
Fat and bitter.
Maybe like a filled ginger nut.
Like a ginger cream.
Yeah, because it's fat.
You just keep going back to fat. It has, I suppose, yeah.
It's the underlying principle at the end of the day.
It's a bit crumbly when it needs to be.
Yeah.
You can't dunk it properly, can you?
He's got no structural integrity.
Indeed, no backbone.
No.
Yeah, so there you go.
And it's bitter taste in the mouth.
Indeed. Yeah.
And disappointing.
Yeah, and then I suppose you could call like Royal
Looks
Supremacy
quite good,
like a wafer.
But
it
it's
just,
disappointing.
Yeah, you see.
So
There
Royal
you go.
Supremacy would be a pink wafer.
Pink wafer, and I think Henry himself is a ginger nut.
And also the pink wafer's good because that's what you eat in the mass, isn't it? You have wafers.
Can't say that.
You don't have pink wafers, but
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
they
it
get
was
called
part-
wafers, don't they?
Yeah.
What about the Royal Supremacy? What kind of biscuit would you call that? I know you said the break with Rome.
Yeah,
That's the same thing.
It's essentially the same thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes biscuits help with revision, I find.
Yeah.
So it's always useful.
They're good for providing energy and perhaps quite a good revision tool too.
Yeah, think
Henry VIII.
Yeah, ginger nut.
Big fat ginger nut.
There we go. Sorted. So I think that's the end of this one. I think that's a nice note to end on.
Yeah, big fat ginger nut.
Big fat ginger nut. Goodbye.
Brilliant. Goodbye.